Yesterday, we deep dived into Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, which, as you may remember, continued Freddy's arc of featuring in progressively worse movies as the series went on, with every entry from 3 onwards marking a huge step down in quality from the previous film. Now, with Freddy's Dead being as jank as it was and its titular character supposedly being definitively offed, there was probably only 3 ways the series could go. 1. Just leave it alone. Let Freddy rest. But you know that's never going to happen because these films make bank! 2. Make something completely soulless and cash grabby. Disregard that Freddy is a joke now and just bring him back with some arbitrary reasoning and keep milking that cash cow till it's dry. Or preferably, 3. Get the property in the hands of someone who truly gives a shit, who can make something smart, clever, imaginative and fresh, someone who'll be a true visionary and refresh the franchise with a wild and risky shake-up. And thankfully, against all odds and in vast contrast with the easy route Hollywood would usually go down, they went with that 3rd option. And so we got Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a bold creative metafiction that played with horror tropes in a way that Scream would be commended for 2 years before that film even existed. An incredibly interesting movie that's easily one of the series' best and would release to the levels of critical acclaim the franchise hadn't had for years. And their reward for such a bold and compelling flick? The single worst box office returns the series would ever see. Of course. Metafiction is all the rage nowadays. Some of the most popular films and TV shows in existence now take great delight in dissecting the tropes of popular narrative structures. Community featured a character extremely aware of the format of the sitcom he was in. Surreal Adult Swim short Too Many Kooks made a subversive nightmare out of old TV show theme songs. An animated powerhouse Rick and Morty continues to be one of the single biggest things on the planet while taking calculated weekly potshots and twists on the conventional practices of any bit of media in any format or genre. While metafiction has literally been around for centuries with known examples dating as far back as the 1300s, it's only recently that it's become a super populous tool utilised often in major film and television. The horror genre though seemingly got a little bit of a kickstart on that. Perhaps it's because fans of the genre have long had in-jokes about the tropes of their favourite films, or perhaps Scream really just was that good. Spoilers. It was. But whatever the reason, after that film's 1996 debut, it felt like there was just an explosion of clever meta titles sprouting up to wink and nod in the audience's direction over the next decade in the horror world. Cabin in the Woods, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, Funny Games, Shaun of the Dead, Leslie Vernon. Meta horror is so big now, it's basically become its own popular subgenre. And everyone credits that little revolution, somewhat rightfully, to Scream. But fewer people know that Scream's very own director was already dabbling in this soon-to-be hugely popular storytelling form only 2 years prior, in an effort to breathe life back into the shambling corpse of one of his most beloved creations. New Nightmare is a film that actively acknowledges Freddy's rockstar overexposure, and uses it as both a commentary on how we as a culture consume horror films and iconography, while also treating it as a kick-off point to create a new Freddy, one that didn't suffer from the same bloated excessive filmography and audience exhaustion, in a film that feels quietly revolutionary and yet surprisingly natural in evolution. The film takes place in a fictionalized real world with Heather Langenkamp returning for the 3rd time to the franchise. Only instead of playing Nancy as she did in Nightmare 1 and 3, she plays Heather Langenkamp, star of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, which should be your first clue that this movie is doing something a little different. It opens with a throwback to the original film, as we are greeted with the very familiar opening visual of an unseen character crafting a spiked hand weapon, though this one looks a little more metal than the one we're used to. Eventually, the character suddenly chops off his own hand and cut! We're on a movie set. And look at that! There's my boy Wes, director and writer of this movie, appearing in a scene he wrote and then directed, where he plays himself directing a fictional new entry within the franchise of the movie he's directing a new entry for in reality, just in case you weren't aware that this film was extremely meta. Behind the scenes of our fake Freddy feature, Heather Langenkamp is watching off camera with her kid Dylan as her husband Chase is working practical effects on the movie, which, fun fact, that also adds to the meta-narrative, as Heather's real-life husband also works in effects, specifically practical makeup, and has 2 Academy Awards for it, one of which is for, I shit you not, The Nutty Professor. Granted, it's for an award in makeup and that checks out, but still, The Nutty Professor is an Academy Award winning movie. Other fun fact, acclaimed film critic Roger Ebert gave The Nutty Professor 2 a 3 out of 4 stars review and said the film was never less than amazing. That doesn't have anything to do with A New Nightmare. I just love that this is a true thing that happened and wanted to share. To get back to the film though, Heather's in-movie husband isn't quite as qualified to work behind the scenes on films as his real-life counterpart apparently, because the dude's sharp-fingered creation suddenly goes apeshit and starts killing people. That is, until it's revealed to be a nightmare when Heather wakes up in her bed due to an earthquake. Or at least it seemed to be a nightmare. But when the quake settles, Chase finds a cut on his finger that matches the one he received in Heather's dream. The earthquake is a recurring motif throughout the movie, often signalling some incoming disturbance. I particularly like the foreshadowing in the immediate following scene where a tremor breaks Heather's wall into the shape of a Freddy slash. That shit's cool. What's less cool, although admittedly in at least one silver lining, extremely convenient for the filmmakers, this film was in production when the 1994 Northridge earthquake hit. So all of the damaged city you see in this film, yeah, that's not constructed sets, that's just real destruction. I mean, if you got it, shoot it, right? There's not many films that can say they've got that level of realism there. Anyway, earthquakes aside, Heather has other concerns going on in her life. This fictionalized version of the Nancy actress has a complicated relationship with her time starring in the Nightmare movies, and she simply can't escape this legacy she doesn't really seem to want. Her kid keeps watching her old films and is having nightmares, a harasser keeps calling her and quoting threats from the film in a creepy voice, every stranger seems to recognize her from it, and with the 10th anniversary of the first film fast approaching, the question of if there'll be another keeps coming up at talk show interviews attended by Freddy Craven fans. Can I just say, by the way, I love this talk show sequence. It's a great little satirical look on how we consume horror and the rock starification of Freddy that turned him from Craven's original demonic entity to something more clown-like. Like, of course, if you're gonna do a talk show with Heather for Nightmare's 10th anniversary, the surprise guest would be a fully costumed up Robert Englund. This scene has so much going for it. Like, obviously seeing Robert in the original makeup and costume again is great, but on top of that, you've got this great little fun poke at both the watered down commercialized product he has become and the way so many people were just totally happy with kids being some of the main consumers of his media. There's this great bit where Englund is humming it up and dancing for the crowd, and he quotes himself in Nightmare 2 saying, "You are all my children now," and then a bunch of the fans in the crowd are like literal children. Because of course they are. Because every kid knew and loved Freddy at the height of his popularity. Robert Englund wore the glove on Nickelodeon, for crying out loud. And the extreme weirdness of that is spotlighted brilliantly here. There are kids in that crowd that are fully dressed up as their child-killing hero. And it's all set to this talk show-ified jingle version of the Nightmare theme. It's such a perfect little satirical microcosm of how strange the relationship was between the American public and this fictionalized child murderer bogeyman. I'd argue this relationship between young audiences and horror is actually one of the bigger themes within the movie. It doesn't appear to just be relegated to this moment. You have the plot point of Dylan watching his mother's movies and having negative reactions to them. You've got Heather being hesitant to take up another Nightmare movie as now that she has a kid she doesn't want to set a bad example. You've got a nurse later in the film who chastises Nancy for letting her kid watch Nightmare. And perhaps most surprising, you've got Bob Shea, New Line Cinema's former CEO, playing himself and literally saying the words, "Kids love horror movies," which is kind of wild, actually. I know obviously it's just a film and he's playing a fictionalized version of himself, but still, hearing a huge horror-making studio head openly and freely admit that they are aware of the relationship between their violent productions and young audiences, especially when this was something horror was so often criticized for in the media, and that those involved in film production would often sidestep by pointing to the age ratings and that the films were intended for an adult audience. It's a shockingly honest moment that I don't think quite got picked up on as much as it should have, partly due to the commentary here being buried under layers of metatextual dissections, though more likely due to the fact that most people just didn't watch New Nightmare if the box office takings are anything to go by. it tends to be the most forgotten film of the franchise. Anyway, as the film goes on, Dylan has a nasty freakout which causes Heather to call Chase to come back home from work. Little does she know he's doing effects on early production of the very nightmare movie that she was dreaming of earlier in the film. And interestingly, the two men she dreamed were killed by the mechanical hand in her nightmare haven't shown up to set. And now it's time for Chase to meet a similar fate, as on the drive home, he is killed by Freddy's claw. The official line is that Chase died in a crash, but Heather knows better and insists on seeing more of his body when she goes to identify him at the morgue, revealing the uncomfortably familiar sight of a slashed open chest. Now a single parent and widower, Nancy struggles to cope with grief and Dylan's seemingly declining mental health. At Chase's funeral, which features a bunch of Elm Street franchise cameos, Nancy has a nightmare in which she witnesses Dylan being pulled into the coffin by a new sinister Freddy. Her Elm Street co-star and on-screen friend John Saxon, who played her father in the original film and plays himself here, snaps her out of it and later in the park suggests she seeks medical attention for both Dylan and herself. And as if perfectly timed to prove his point, Dylan, in an almost trance-like state, climbs to the top of a park attraction and almost severely injures himself falling off of it. Troubled by her nightmares, Nancy reaches out to Robert Englund, who, like many others in this film, plays himself, to tell him that she's been dreaming of Freddy. And it's implied through the conversation and the painting that Robert is currently doing that he also has been having some surreal experiences with this menacing entity. Robert also mentions to Nancy that Wes was telling him about the new Nightmare movie script, and that he'd gotten as far as the point where Dylan was trying to reach God. Though this meant nothing to Robert, and he put it down to some kind of auteur genius / weirdness on Wes's part, Nancy though obviously recalls Dylan at the park reaching into the sky. After another Dylan freakout which sees him slash at his mother in a nightmare and then in the waking world convulse and vomit, Nancy takes him to the hospital where he has to stay overnight. Nancy then visits Wes to ask if he can make some sense of what is happening to her and Dylan. And in her visit with Craven, we get one of my favourite instances of Pope in the Pool style exposition. If you don't know what Pope in the Pool means, it's a term coined by screenwriter Blake Snyder in his book Save the Cat, where he describes the experience of seeing an early draft of a film where a large amount of exposition was delivered by the Pope, who was, unsurprisingly, in a pool. So distracted by this image, Snyder didn't notice the film stopping to exposition dump. So Pope in the Pool, in its most simplistic sense, means to disguise necessary exposition dumps with either interesting visuals, set pieces, character comedy, whatever. Wes tells Nancy that he only knows as much as she does. He has precognitive dreams of scenes, wakes up, and then writes them down. He hypothesizes that there's some great evil that existed within the Nightmare movies, a kind of abstract force that has been captured in art throughout the ages and takes on the forms of a culture's artistic representations of evils, in this case, Freddy Krueger. It's a very out there concept and takes a fair amount of Wes sitting around and explaining to get the gist of it. But don't worry, the Pope in the Pool is coming when the scene closes out on the deliciously metatextual image of Wes's computer screen, on which lies a script version of the exact scene we just saw play out in front of us. The screen even fades to black as the end of the sequence in the screenplay reads, "Fade to black." Awesome stuff. Nobody ever notices that we just watched a prolonged sequence of two people explaining the plot to one another, because our big takeaway is always that brilliant final reveal. It's bizarrely creepy as well in an existential way, like no one in the sequence is acting with any level of free will, and that's super interesting. After that eerie little note, Nancy gets attacked by the evil Freddy entity and is slashed in her dream but carries the injury through into the real world. This instance panics her and she goes to check on Dylan at the hospital. Her friend Julie, who often babysits Dylan, is also there, having had a bad dream about Dylan that made her paranoid. The film continues to make little meta throwbacks to the original Elm Street movie. As well visiting Dylan, Heather has another nightmare about the Freddy entity that gives her a grey hair streak, just like her character Nancy got from stress and fear of her nightmares in the original film. Heather also has further troubles at the hospital when the doctors sedate Dylan against the wishes of both her and Julie. And with Dylan now dreaming, that gives a way for the Freddy entity to surface and murder Julie in one of the best scenes of the film. Not only is this a throwback to Tina's death in Elm Street 1, but it also offers a cool alternative perspective on it. This time, the audience sees Freddy handling the body, and that's such a great way to both homage the initial work while also adding this new layer to it. Plus, you would think that Freddy dragging his victim up the wall would take a lot of the terror and magic out of it, like seeing the strings on the puppet, but it's surprisingly just as chilling and effective a visual. Well done, Wes lad. After the murder, a sleepwalking Dylan leaves the hospital and wanders home, with Heather giving chase after him across a busy interstate, Freddy taunting her along the way by dangling him in front of traffic. As she gets back home, her reality and fiction start to collide. She runs into her friend John, but when she begs for his help, he's confused by her calling him John. As the conversation goes on, she realizes she isn't talking to her friend Mr. Saxon, but rather the character he played, her on-screen father, Don Thompson. I told you this thing gets really meta. So many headfucks all over the place in this one. Heather realizes she has to play along, and as she falls into the role, her clothes, her street, and her house all become Nancy's. The nightmare of her fiction becoming the nightmare of her reality. Going inside the house, she follows a trail of Dylan's sleeping pills into this surreal hell world, and holy shit! Does it look cool? Look at this set design, holy balls, it's awesome! It's like Freddy's Boiler Room commissioned as a carnival with creative input from H.R. Giger, who'd been told to make it look like Return to Oz. Amazing stuff there. Anyway, this is where our final confrontation goes down. We get a lot of surreal Freddy Nightmare trickery, like his arms stretching to inhuman lengths to try and grab Dylan, his jaw unhinging like a snake in an attempt to eat the kid. There's some weird shit with his tongue that admittedly didn't quite work for me. I think it comes off a little goofy personally, but tongue bit aside, it's a very effective and imaginative closer in a fantastic setting that ends with the mother and son teaming up, getting the upper hand, trapping the Freddy entity in a furnace, burning it alive, and escaping back to the real world, where they find a screenplay of the exact story they just experienced and a note from Wes saying thank you for playing Nancy once again. Heather begins to read and the credits roll. And in a little bit of fun flavour, Freddy Krueger is credited as playing himself. And that little trippy number we just explored is New Nightmare. I kinda see why it didn't do so well, to be honest. I actually think this film would have done excellently if released now with a few updates to keep it in touch with modern cinema sensibilities. But back in 1994, this was probably just a little too out there for most. It's genuinely ahead of its time, and Craven doesn't get anywhere near enough credit for that. The meta stuff isn't just a cheap gimmick for a few moments that'll make the audience think they're clever. It's substantially important to the story being told. There's a clear intention on a thematic level to explore an audience's relationship with stories and myth here, especially younger audiences in relation to horror. The idea that this evil was being trapped in the ongoing nightmare narrative and only escaped due to those films ending production and the death of a myth-like icon and pop culture figure in Freddy's Dead could even be interpreted as commentary on how stories, especially horror, let us tackle the darker sides of existence in a safe way. It makes sense, right? The fictional reality within this story presents us with this great evil that was safe when explored in the context of fiction, but when we stopped handling it within stories, it was able to leak out into this real world and cause actual damage. Maybe I'm overstretching here because I'm a constant advocate for how the horror genre has uses and gratifications beyond cheap thrills, and one of the things I champion is its ability to safely discuss more traumatic and unpleasant subject matter, but like, I'm not basing this on nothing. There's definitely something there. At the very least, Wes is absolutely attempting to comment somewhat on our culture's relationship with art and the way we consume it, and more specifically, horror and the nightmare films. The image of the man Wes Craven once imagined as a sexual predator in his original script, high-fiving a kid in a Freddy mask on a talk show, makes certain of that. There's a definite critique of the commercialization of Freddy, which is something I understand Craven was never a big fan of, always pushing for his more sinister and darker characterization in the scripts he wrote, and never at all seeing the guy as a children's toy or franchise face to sell kids lunchboxes. Speaking of the more sinister Freddy, oh, the Freddy entity is a good villain. It should have been an almost impossible job to bring Freddy back to being something that could be taken seriously after you've seen him dissolve into an overplayed caricature parodying the Wizard of Oz and performing Looney Tunes style slapstick. But with a slightly new look, a sinister stare, and a totally quip-free performance, Wes, Robert Englund, and the filmmaking team managed to bring him right back to being something worth fearing. I'm not saying the movie is scary by today's standards. Audiences are a little harder to scare these days, and we're used to a lot more significant levels of both violence and tension. Plus, there's the very occasional bit that just doesn't play right. I struggle to take the tongue bit seriously, for example. But all that said, the entity is such a strong step towards making Freddy frightening again. It's such a smart move to realize that Freddy had become too big to be scary, acknowledge that within your own narrative, and then create a plot where a new characterization sprouts from the back of that overexposure. In lesser hands, that could have been messy, but against all odds, they pull it off and it works. I don't know what they did as well to Robert Englund to make him seem so filled out, but he looks intimidatingly broad in this one. Maybe it's just costume with the long trench coat, or they gave him like a more padded sweater or something, but Freddy's looking huge. Love the new design and love the vicious way Robert Englund plays it. God, that man is so versatile in how he can handle this character. I will say though, I'm not as big a fan of his claw hand this time round. I prefer the glove over like an organic matter, but that's just nitpicking. He looks great. Huge step up from the rubbery faced jokester we got in Freddy's Dead. I don't just want to throw all praise on Englund and his entity though, because to be honest, everyone acts really well in this. Heather Langenkamp especially is an amazing performer. And with the film being this crazy meta-textual weirdness about a widowed, grieving single mother trying to handle her own son's well-being, her complicated legacy, and this descent into some nightmare-like hellish reality, she's got a lot more to work with this time around than teenager trying to stay alive. Not that she wasn't great in 1 and 3, but there's a lot more substance and nuance to her performance here. And big props to the kid too. Like, he puts in the work, you know? It's not the best performance you'll ever see, but for a child, he gives it the beans. Well done, kid. And that's the thing, really. Almost every part of this film works. I'm hard pressed to find any real issue I can point to and be like, yeah, this is where it loses me. Sure, there's that tongue thing, but that's not a deal breaker. It's on screen for less than 30 seconds. But other than that, the film ranges from solid to great to at times even exceptional. It just sort of came out at the wrong time, I guess. The passion was all there, the people involved were all great, it got good reviews, but for whatever reason, maybe it was Freddy exhaustion, or maybe the slasher was just going out of fashion after too much time in the spotlight, it just didn't get its fair dues on release, and remains one of the lesser viewed series entries. But on the bright side, it's starting to be reassessed a fair amount, and finding new eyes now that metafiction has become the big thing we're all obsessed with, and for what it's worth, in my experience, the vast majority of Nightmare fans who have seen it rated very highly. I genuinely put it up there with the top of the series for me. Not quite as brilliant as 1 or as entertaining as 3, but it's better in my opinion than any of the other sequels. Plus, it actually works really great when watched with 1 and 3 as a kind of Heather Langenkamp trilogy. I know it's not technically part of the same continuity, I know, but like, however, come on, it's not exactly a reboot, is it? It actively functions as a sequel to pre-existing content. A meta sequel, sure, but it literally doesn't work as a film without acknowledging the first entry. Its entire plot hinges on the existence and cultural understanding of that film being a thing that happened. So for me, it totally works as a trilogy. I know my whole pitch with Slasher Season was that I was going to cover the entire original continuities of these characters, and this technically breaks the rules, but cut me some slack, it counts. It's in the same Blu-ray box set as the others I've got, so Also, this way I get to fill out the days without ever having to resort to doing any of the reboots. Although since I'm bringing them up now, if you want my quick thoughts for some weird completionist sake, here they are. Awful. Safe, functional, but mostly boring. Not actually without merit, but way too grimy, cynical and nihilistic in that Rob Zombie way for me. And even with some positives, it's just infinitely worse than the original. Haven't seen it. Sorry, no Platinum Trophy completionist run for you guys, I'm afraid. Anyway, that's New Nightmare. And apparently also my quick thoughts on a bunch of franchise slasher reboots, so I guess that's out there now. You got a whole 5 videos for the price of 1 there. Only 4 of them were extremely lazy and short. But don't worry, because tomorrow's video won't be lazy. We're all wrapped up with Elm Street for now, and we're about to make our way over to Camp Crystal Lake as we begin to tackle one of the biggest and most recognizable slasher series of all time, with Friday the 13th. So if you don't want to miss that, remember to subscribe to my Only Dance at the red button below. And please, if you're enjoying this show, help me out with a like and a comment. Gotta get that algorithm boost, baby! Also, if you're really enjoying it and would like to gain access to some fun exclusives, then you can become a patron at the Patreon link in the description below. No pressure on that one though, just if you fancy it. As always, I've been Dan Drambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season, and I will see you tomorrow.